Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius Podcast. I have Richard J. Martin. He's the Clarence Hartley Covault Distinguished Professor at Iowa State. He's also a Dr. E.A. Benbrook Endowed Chair in Pathology and Parasitology. So we're going to talk about parasites and drugs used to treat them. So, Rich, thanks for coming. How you doing?
I'm good, thank you. And thank you for the invitation, Rich. I appreciate that.
Yeah, I've spoken to a number of parasitologists, and people usually have their favorites that they focus on. So which parasites are you looking at predominantly?
We work on filaria. These parasites are transmitted by biting insects, things like mosquitoes, black flies. They're quite common, relatively common in West Africa and parts of South America. The biting insects carry these tiny little microscopic worms, nematode parasites known as microfilaria, and when they transfer them in the bite to the uninfected person, the parasite, the microfilaria, starts to grow inside them, and it has, depending on its species, a number of predisposed sites where it'll end up. So there are different examples of the species of filaria. One of the very dramatic ones that people are trying to control and eradicate is Onchocerca volvulus. It's a name that's probably a bit difficult to remember. So a lot of people know it by river blindness. This is a shocking condition that where part of the parasite, the larvae, can end up in the cornea, that is the eye, and damage and destroy the eyesight of the individual. The parasite lives, or the worm, the black fly, lives by the river, and so that's where the disease is seen, hence river blindness. That's one example. And there are other examples that are quite common in dogs. Most veterinarians will treat and prevent, and owners will prevent, a condition known as heartworm. It's very common in Louisiana and the southwest of the US, and it's necessary to control that worm, Diofilaria immitis. So there is plenty of examples of these filarial worms. They may be different to some of your other guys that you've spoken to.
So of the the worms that you study, which ones have the most dramatic or unusual method of parasitism once they're in the host?
Well, they're all a bit dramatic to me. You maybe remember the movie Aliens, do you? The idea.
Oh, they burst out of their chest.
Yes. It's quite dramatic, and of course that movie was based on some of the behaviors of these parasites. They do get into places that can cause quite disturbing changes in the body. Let's give you one example of another filarial parasite. This is known as posh name, lymphatic filariasis or elephantiasis. People who have this condition, again, predominantly in more deserted areas in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, they end up with these very distorted limbs that are, because the lymphatics, that's part of the drainage system of the legs, gets blocked, and so they swell up, and with a skin infection they end up with legs that look like, quite literally, like elephants, and that's a very disturbing condition. People who have that condition become, as you can imagine, social outcasts, and it's really a sort of modern form of, well, it's not the same disease, but people are rejected socially and they find it very difficult to live. It's a sort of equivalent, if you like, of leprosy. So that's one very dramatic example. There are other stories. I mentioned river blindness earlier. Go for it.
For the elephantitis, so just a question. So a person could have, I've seen some pictures of it, they're massively swollen legs or other parts, but the swelling is based on what? The accumulation of lymph, or what's in there? Like if people try to drain, the swollen limb to see what's in there and what's there?
Well, what happens is, as part of the normal circulation of the body, you probably are aware that you have arteries and veins, arteries coming from the heart, veins carrying the blood back to the heart. But in addition to that, you also have what's known as lymphatic vessels. These are drainage systems for the extracellular fluid that is outside of the body. Sorry, I should say outside of the circulating system, and it returns the lymph to the blood. But if you block that off, quite literally, the legs will swell up. I don't know whether you remember going to the doc, and they might just squeeze sometimes odd places, your neck or the back of your legs, sometimes in your groin, and they're feeling for these, what they call glands or lymph nodes, and that's part of that drainage system. You block
I felt
that.
them myself in my neck, when I've been sick.
That's them, and that system, if it's blocked, quite literally, the part that's being drained blows up like a balloon. So that's the lymphatic filariasis or the elephantiasis problem.
Well, for that parasite, does it proliferate in the lymph? Is that like a preferred environment for it, or where does it go?
Yeah, it lives, and if you recover them, they're jiggling around and diving around. There's a male and a female, and they get together as all males and females do, and they end up reproducing. And the female releases these tiny little microscopic worms, microfilaria, into the blood, and that's what's picked up by the biting fly that's transferred on to the next host. So that's where they prefer to live. And I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but you could easily, if you come across these parasites for the first time, you think, what on earth led them to end up there, and why do they, of all places, want to go and live there? I can't answer that question. It's something that's a mystery to all of us. Why do they choose these particular sites? But they do, and they become adapted to living there. I suppose it's
in that particular disease, once a person gets it, are insects then predisposed to bite them in those places that are swollen, or no?
Oh, no, it's not the sites that are swollen. It's anywhere. It turns out that these microfilaria that are released by the adults in the lymph get right into the blood and circulate around the body, and they end up during the feeding time of the insects, typically in the morning. They end up under the skin, and so that's where the next bite, when it comes on, the little insect starts chewing away, has a bite at the skin, and it sucks up some fluid from the human, and will take in this next infection, the microfilaria. And this little worm, microfilaria, matures in the insect, And when it's mature, it's ready to be transferred to the next person, the next host.
So, out of all these diseases, I've heard them called like neglected diseases. They affect, I guess, millions of people, but is there any in particular that has interest and funding behind it, or are these unfortunately more curiosities, even though they're so dire?
I'm just maybe missed part of your question. Are you asking who's interested in these diseases? Did you say that?
Yeah, like out of the diseases you studied, they affect tons of people, from what I understand. But is there funding and research and interest to try to combat them?
Oh yes, there's a series of sources of funding for looking at one of the particular sources that's driven is the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. They have a particular interest, but they're very applied, and they want, I'm being unkind, but maybe I'm not, they want practical, as they call it, quick solutions. The NIH is very interested in these diseases, but it's prepared to take a longer term view about it. It's interested in basic biology as well as development of drugs to solve the problem. So for our lab, the NIH is a major funder of this work. But here's an interesting point. One of the points that if I can get across, I find it fascinating, is that because these diseases are predominantly in, shall we say, in financially challenged countries, the economies of these countries is pretty modest. The development of drugs for these primarily human conditions is not primarily for humans. It's actually for animals in the Western world. The economic driver for drug development is for pet animals, filarial animals. I mentioned heartworm in dogs. That's the one of the major drivers for commercial drug development, which is kind of surprising to me. Normally it's the other way around. You think that the human need or the human economic benefits would drive the drug development, but it's not the case for some of these neglected tropical diseases. And specifically here, it turns out that the new drugs, ivermectin, one classic drug, and it looks like emidepside, a recently developed product, could be go through phase 2 and phase 3 for human development. It's already used in animals, small animals, pet animals. So that's kind of a topsy-turvy economic situation. The idea.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
Do these parasites you study, these worms, do they have viruses that prey upon them?
That is. I'm trying to do a bit of homework. I wondered what sorts of question might come up. It is recognized that these parasites, there is evidence that they have viruses. We don't know much about them, and there hasn't been an extensive or sufficient study. They are susceptible to bacterial infections, and they do, bizarrely, these parasites have their own immune system. They're able to fight off bacterial infections. They have an innate immunity. And it does, some of these primitive immune responses that these worms have does overlap with our own primitive immune systems. That seems a bit odd, wouldn't it? I don't know whether you thought about that. Why should a parasite have an immune system? But it does.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
Well, in order to do its job, I mean, it also understands how to evade its host immune system in a lot of contexts. So I guess that it has its own onboard knowledge, and then it's able to go further and work with itself.
Yeah, to extend that a little bit, it has a nervous system. I like to kind of wind people up and say it actually has a brain. I think that maybe is going a bit too far, but it does have a nervous system, and it can adapt. It will respond to touch. It will detect chemical signals, and it will detect places that are warmer and colder. So it uses its nervous system to search out its environment and find preferred locations. And a number of experiments have demonstrated that it does have a primitive form of memory. So if you want to exaggerate the story, you could say it actually has a brain, which is significantly more than a lot of viruses and bacteria. And it's possible because the genome is much, much larger than bacteria.
Well, I mean, is there a latency once it affects a given host? Is there a latency period before it really takes effect?
Oh, yeah. So, I don't know, let's imagine you got bitten by one of these black flies and that was carrying Onchocerca. It might well be a number of weeks before you start feeling some irritation in your eyes and scratching at your eyes. So yes is the answer to that. And jumping a little bit from the river blindness, which I was talking about then, to the lymphatic filariasis. Again, it's a matter of a cumulative infection. You can probably get away with one or two parasite infections and not even notice it. But if you get several and it keeps building up, and for some unknown reason, some people react worse to the parasite load than others. Some people can tolerate it and don't notice it, but others react very badly and get these terrible reactions, itching skin. So it depends on the individual that gets infected, but not instantly. And it takes, depending on the parasite, it can take several months, certainly for this elephantiasis, to build up and become the observable condition.
Is it someone's infected with many worms, or is it just one worm that grows bigger and bigger in its condition?
No, it's typically it's several worms, and the adult worm gets to just like we do. It'll get to an adult size, and it won't get any bigger. The infection that occurs is often due to an accumulation of the number of parasites. And then these parasites, the other thing that you probably picked up from other folks that you've talked to, they live inside you or the human host, and they have to tell the host, the human, look, don't attack me. They have to send out signals to the immune response. They have to control the host immune response, and they do it in quite marvelous ways. They can manipulate the immune system, inhibit the immune system, and so they secrete a number of active substances, and depending on the individual, the active substances can do the job, and there's no reaction. Sometimes an individual will react to these substances that are released, a bit like venom from an insect bite. You start to react quite badly to it. So it does depend on what is released and the individual.
Well, I've heard some parasites, put out extracellular vesicles and communicate with each other, and they probably have some form of quorum sensing, knowing when to, start the next stage of their onslaught. Maybe that's why there's latency. So, I mean, it seems like there's a whole complement of sophisticated behaviors, if that's correct, right?
Yeah, you've got some good knowledge there, Rich. That's quite an exciting concept. How do these characters sense the quorum, and when how do they limit and detect the numbers of parasites there? How does the male find the female? The female, sometimes with these microfilaria, the onchocerca, the female will live in nodules. How does the male find its way and search them out and get there? It's quite some very interesting biology that goes on. And like you say, they send out various signals, and one of these signals that's attracted recent attention is just as you've mentioned, these extracellular vesicles that actually send out molecular signals as well as chemical signals to the cellular environment, to the host environment, and get the cells to start behaving differently.
Oh, they're actually, you're saying EVs from some of these worms are instructing our own cells to change behavior?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, the reason why I bring this up is if, when looking for drugs to combat, these worms, because they're multicellular, perhaps they would be less adaptive in, let's say, a bacterial infection. And maybe if you interrupt their communication, or if you cause some other, dysfunction to them, they won't be able to react as speedily, and you'll be able to kill them off or stop them communicating and proliferating.
Yeah, I think the nature of many of these parasite diseases, they are, by comparison, they are more controllable in the, shall we say, the Western world environment, where you've got good sanitation and there are a number of drugs that are available, that not enough drugs, but where you have poor sanitation, where the vectors, that is these insects that transmit the disease, and where toilet facilities are not adequate, these parasites will persist. For example, the dog heartworm, that persists here in the US despite probably reasonable sanitation control by the pet owners, but you only need a few wild dogs and a few biting insects to transmit the disease, and it becomes very difficult to control. So in theory, yes, you should be able to break the cycle and control these diseases, but in an economically challenged environment, that doesn't actually happen. And so that's the challenge. Can you limit the number of infected people with drugs? Can you control the disease by typically once a year drug administration? That's called MDA, mass drug administration. So if you and I were living in parts of Africa, we might take one of these anti-parasitic drugs that we work on and are interested in. We might take those once or perhaps twice a year, and that would be sufficient to keep the parasites under control.
I mean, an even more difficult question probably is, do you know if there's any microbiome associated with these parasites? Like, someone that has, let's say, this elephantitis condition, if you're able to aspirate a bunch of fluid, you've got, a bunch of worms in it, that you're able to then, do shotgun sequencing and see if there's a microbiome or DNA that's not showing up normally.
What we do know, and quite a number of people, I've seen this on a number of grant applications. It's not something we do, but a lot of parasites, most commonly, are what they call soil transmitted helminths, STHs, soil transmitted helminths. They're transmitted by the fecal-oral route, and living in the intestine in the gut, secreting these various substances that we've talked about, they do alter the microbiome, and microbiota do change. And it's interesting to see what those changes are. It's not my area of research, and it is an interesting area that's been somewhat expanded recently with this fascination with the effect of the microbiota on the human health.
So what big questions are you trying to answer about these helminths in general?
Well, I would claim that one of my background interests and trainings as I started off as a veterinarian and seeing lots of parasites in animals, and I became interested in drugs. This idea that you can cure diseases with a drug. Maybe people have got used to it, but the concept is and was originally the idea of searching for this, quotes, magic bullet that could cure somehow this drug. You would take this chemical compound, swallow it, and somehow it would find this disease in your body and deal with the problem, this magic bullet. And this is what we've been interested in. Can you find a magic bullet to cure these diseases very effectively? You're probably aware that there's no such thing as a perfect drug. There's always a risk benefit. One of the challenges is if you use a drug repeatedly for any disease, even cancer, eventually you will get the development of resistance. And so that's one of the issues that fascinates us. How do these parasites develop resistance? Can we design some new drugs that are resistance busting? And that's what drives our work. How do these drugs work? How do we prevent the development of resistance? And that's the agenda that's been driving our work as pharmacologists and parasitologists interested in finding better and improved cures for these rather unpleasant conditions.
So are there any particular worm-based diseases that are far worse than others, or one that you think really there's an order to fixing them or attacking them with drugs? What's the one that's most in need?
I suppose I'm trying not to avoid a sort of game on that, because if you've got any disease, for you as an individual, that particular disease is the most serious. But how do you quantify the seriousness of an infection? Do you measure the number of human deaths per year, or do you measure the lost economic effects? In other words, let's supposing you had a parasite that stopped people from working. It made them feel uncomfortable, so that they, instead of working a full year, they only worked maybe once a year, but it had a massive influence on the whole population. Would that be considered worse than a disease or a parasite that would kill off, well, literally kill only a few people? Which one is the most serious? And so you have these debates about what is actually the most serious. We have this phrase, and I'd be lucky if I can remember what it's dailies. It's something like the distributed annual loss yearly. You count up the number of lost productivity of an individual. And some worms, like the gastrointestinal worms, some worms like Ascaris, they may not, the mortality may not be high, but because of the morbidity, the number of people affected, it's more serious. So I guess I'm saying to you, it depends on the criteria that you use. What is the most serious? We think that the lost productivity on a very, very large number of people through these diseases and the social rejection should be weighted more heavily than just counting the number of people that lose their lives. So conditions like filariasis, the river blindness and the lymphatic filariasis and ascariasis, we think all of these are serious problems. And if you can find a drug that actually can treat and prevent all of these with the MDA treatment once a year, then actually everybody's a winner. So rather than pick a specific, you want to find a drug that actually affects all of these. It would be nice if you can.
Well, very good. Any breakthroughs that you see in terms of understanding? Like, are people looking at, for instance, viruses associated with parasites, or like where do you think the big breakthroughs will come, or is it just slow, steady progress and understanding?
I wish I could promise breakthroughs, but I think it's part of my. I hope I can communicate some enthusiasm for the subject, and I think they're intermittent breakthroughs that come along. They're not necessarily absolute cures, but they're advances in technology that allow you to improve the treatments. There is this problem of parasites is very often it's a political and social issue that needs to be dealt with, and I think the big breakthroughs will come from an improved political environment. I don't mean Democrat versus Republican. I mean good constitutional government, good proper government will help a lot of these conditions. But it would be nice if we can get a much better drug that can take us forward. And there is the possibility of one of the drugs that we are working on, imidepside, will prove satisfactory. It's going through phase 2 and hopefully get to phase 3 for the treatment of filariasis. And if the DNDi get that licensing and it proves effective and safe for humans, then I would say yes, that's a big breakthrough, because it'll be able to help us control this disease much more quickly, the filariasis disease much more quickly. So that's one of the positives I see. A breakthrough is getting an effective drug accepted for human treatment.
I have a question that just came to mind. Imagining worms in the soil, and I mean, mostly in soils, because at least some of them are in soils. Are they in contact with, mycorrhizae and fungi? And has anyone looked at the association of worms and fungi? Like perhaps they're, they're predisposed to attacks by them. Perhaps they have a commensal relationship with them, just because they're in and around them a lot. It seems like at least in their initial environment.
Yeah. Have you? I'm just asking you now. Have you come across or folks you've spoken to called things called nematophagous fungi? Have you heard of those?
No, those are what, fungi that infect worms.
Well, I don't know about infect them. They eat them. They're rather interesting characters, and I came across them when I had a contacts with the Danish parasitologists, and it's interesting to see how the shall we say the more understandably green culture in Denmark, they didn't want to use drugs to control parasites as much. And so what they found out, they developed this preparation for feeding horses these nematophagous fungi. And what happens is and this was an experimental system that worked, you feed the preparation to, this was to actually the horses that were under test. And when the parasites, the larvae, the little wriggly worms, hatch out in the sort of in the grass and in the feces, they do so with these at the same time as these nematophagous fungi that have also been fed to the horse. And these things, you tap it in on your Google, and what you'll see, these quite sort of exciting to watch. They throw loops, these little fungi, little hyphae, and there's a sort of trigger, and when the worm wriggles into this little hoop, it traps it, squeezes itself and will kill off the infectious larvae, or the larvae that are growing to the next stage. So the simple answer is yes, there is a relationship between a biology and a continuous warfare between these nematodes that live in the soil and the various fungi that are found. And just
these like lasso them and strangle them. Wow. Huh.
Yeah, and another comment, just a wave of enthusiasm here, that one of the very important drugs that was discovered by Bill Campbell, he ended up with a Nobel Prize, was a drug called ivermectin. And it comes from Streptomyces avomytilis, which is a sort of fungal organism that grows in the soil. And it was found by his Japanese collaborator and recovered from a golf course in Japan near the fence. So the pair of them ended up isolating and producing ivermectin, which has become really the gold standard. So that came from fungal soil samples. So the answer is yes, absolutely, Rich. That's definitely the case. And some fungi definitely have got it in for worms and parasites, and they make these very effective substances that will kill off the worms. The trick is to find a substance that kills the worms without killing the host, and that's the hard thing, to find a selective killer.
Yeah, no, that's true. Well, very good. What's the best way for people to find out more about your research?
Well, you're very welcome to Google Richard J. Martin. I'm at Iowa State. We keep all our research on ResearchGate. You can get a copy of that. Or if somebody sent me an email, we're quite happy to get people interested in it. One of the things that I appreciate about this opportunity, we are very keen to see if we can increase the interest in this general area. So if you're interested in our research, just type my name in and ResearchGate. You can see all the papers there, or contact anyone at Iowa State University. But I really want to just thank you for taking the time to show an interest in our field and actually helping the audiences to find out a little bit more about these parasites, because I think they are fascinating creatures, and I wish we could somehow get more visual material over to the public, because I think they'd find them, after they got over the sort of perhaps scary bit like the aliens are coming to get them, I think they'd find them absolutely fascinating. They are a world apart, and they do things that nobody would dream of.
Well, one thing, last question, I was about to let you go, but so because they're somewhat macroscopic, much more so than a virus. And I guess light microscopy could probably pick them up. Have scientists made movies of a parasite infecting, a worm interacting with a cell or infecting a cell or gaining entry?
They're only scientific ones, but I think it would be, it would be quite fun to make a documentary, or even 2 or 3 documentaries on the different parasites to show, what the marvelous techniques. I only know various examples. Folks like David Attenborough could actually go beyond just looking at gross animals or big animals. They could actually start looking at these other organisms, and there's a whole new world to look at and see what these guys get up to and how they get around their life cycle. It's a fascinating story, and yes, I think it would make quite gripping TV or a movie. No matter, you need a skill to be able to know what the public wants and where to take it. But that kind of thing would be rather exciting to see. I think the public would, in fact, I know the public would be fascinated by it.
Yeah, excellent. Well, Richard, thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. It's been a good call.
Thank you for taking the time. My best wishes, and I'm sure you'll get back to me if you want more.
Oh, yeah.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.